All right, well, welcome everybody. We're so glad to have you here. My name is Randall Fullington. I'm the Executive Director for the Office of Academic and Learning Innovation. I want to thank you for joining us today. My notes say third annual BoulderTalks, but it's actually the fourth year. The first year was kind of unofficial. We hadn't found a name yet. But this is our fourth year of doing this, and it's really, the speaker series came about from a desire to build the community, see Boulder with other universities through visiting experts who are doing innovative work. And again, my notes say quality online education, but it's really expanded beyond that to the campuses as well, to non-traditional, to alternative credentials, to a much larger space. And it's been really exciting to see that grow as we've developed the speaker series. And so much of that has to do with you guys here who've been coming to these events, so it's really great to see you. With so much that we do in this kind of space, the series is really a community effort. And so I'd like to recognize the Center for Teaching and Learning for being a co-sponsor for this event this year, so please give them a thank you. And then I'd like to introduce our speaker today. So Dr. Randy Bass is Vice President for Strategic Education Initiatives and Professor of English, at Georgetown University, where he leads the Designing the Future initiative and the Red House. For 13 years, he was the founding executive director of Georgetown's Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship, otherwise known as CANDLES, and for 7 years, Vice Provost of Education. He's been working at the intersections of university transformation, emerging technologies, and the scholarship of teaching and learning for more than 30 years. In 1994, the American Studies Crossroads Project, which he founded and directed for 10 years, was the first ever web-based project funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education. So Randy also sits on the boards of several universities and higher education organizations. He's also been a Fulbright Scholar, Carnegie Scholar with the Carnegie Academy for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And since 2024, he's been serving as Senior Advisor to the President of the University of North Texas. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Randy Bass.
Thank you, Randall. Thank you so much for the invitation, and it's great to see everyone. I met someone recently who said that whenever they're in a talk and people are spread all the way back, which of course is fine, she invites people to, whoever would like an upgrade to business class. So if you have trouble seeing the slides, feel free to do that. I'm not pushing you, just there's some text and stuff might be easier, but it's really fantastic to be here. I spent many years at coming to Boulder with the Center for Teaching and Learning 15 years ago and more, and just spent many weeks here that I really enjoyed. And it's really lovely to be back and to be here. And I've had a great day engaging with you and Kirk's staff and the CTL and the ALI. So such a pleasure to be here. So 13 years ago, give or take, the university founded something called the Designing the Futures of the University initiative that Randall mentioned. And this is the main enterprise that I run now. It came to be known as the Red House because we needed space, and they gave us this little red townhouse that was across the street from the university. So if you were standing on that street corner and looking across, you'd see the library and the campus and the walls of the campus and everything. So it's literally just across the street from the university. I never really even noticed it was red when we moved in, but then people started talking about the Red House, including the president. So let me tell you what I saw at the Red House. And so then people started giving me money, and I thought, okay, I think I recognize a brand when I see one. So we stuck with that. But so that sign, which was originally one that I had made for blown up and put over the fireplace inside the Red House, yes, a university can reinvent itself, was the first thing I bought for the Red House. And this was 2013, so many of you will remember, this is the moment of MOOC madness, right? All massive online courses, college was gonna end, right? There was so much noise and tumult, not dissimilar from this moment. And there were all these new startups that were starting to create colleges, and many people claimed that the only way to reform higher ed was for new things to start outside traditional universities. And we'll show higher ed how it's done. We'll unbundle, we'll do this and we'll do that. So this, right, the disruptors. So that was my self-affirmation. Yes, a university can reinvent itself. Thank you very much. So we blew that up, put it over the mantle. It was like, nobody here is probably, or few people here is old enough to remember the Saturday Night Live sketch, Stuart Smalley, but this was our daily Stuart Smalley affirmation. We are good enough, we are smart enough, we are creative enough to reinvent the university. Then when we renovated the terrace 3 years ago, I bought these kiosks for outdoor art displays and we moved it outside. When the initiative was launched, the then President DeGioia gave a wonderful talk to launch it. It's actually still online, really brilliant talk. But one of the things he said was, rather than responding to the potential disruptions, meaning MOOCs and all, by narrowly focusing on preserving who we are, we believe that Georgetown can make a distinctive contribution by treating the question of our future as a challenge of imagination, creativity, and design. So that was my mandate, was to treat this moment and to lead a unit with the challenge of imagination, creativity, and design. So for the first decade, we moved in this little red house, and our goal was really to focus on what we thought was the emerging paradigm of education. What did we think was coming next? Where did we think, as Wayne Gretzky would say, where is the puck going? And then to design projects for that emerging paradigm. So that's how we thought of ourselves, that we were looking at what was next. And even if the projects we launched were very small, and some of them were very small scale projects, I thought of, as long as they were small game-changing projects, then we were doing this paradigmatic innovation. We were looking to the next paradigm. And early on, I coined that was our first rule, maybe it's our only rule, which is that every project that we support had to break at least one rule. Meaning that, I had run the Center for Teaching and Learning for 13 years. It was now in extremely capable hands, big, wonderful, robust center. They were helping faculty figure out how to use the latest pedagogies and innovations in their classroom. Our job was to try to shift the model. And so for that, every project we supported had to mess with something, mess with the way we count credits, mess with what we give credit for, mess with what we considered a course, how the academic year connected to summers, et cetera, how we counted faculty load. As long as we were breaking some rule, then we were doing what we were supposed to do. Now, I think our job isn't, in part to your question, isn't just to think, where do we think this is going? We're still asking that question, but where we think this is going is like next year, or a year, 2 years from now, right? Back then, it was like 5, 10 years from now, what would we like to have in place? And what should we be chipping away at in the model so that 5, 10 years from now, we've socialized a lot of these ideas. Now, I think we're talking, a quarter of that time span. So to me, the salient part of what it means to think about the emerging paradigm has to do with humanity, and I think all of us feel that in this moment. And I believe that really the salient project of the higher education right now is to rehumanize itself, is to recover what its old, deep tradition is around humanistic values, recognize that the forms by which those humanistic values have been transmitted are probably obsolete, and to figure out what it means to deliver a kind of humanistic education in a whole new mode and a whole new modality for a whole new century. So to me, the capsulization of the thesis of this talk is that reinvention and rehumanization are now inseparable. So I think we've been on this path for a long time, and I don't think it's just AI that's changing it, but that's certainly accelerated. Certainly the current federal administration is accelerating, but I think we've on a really interesting path. So taking you back to 1995, I think of our transition to the learning paradigm as being about, in the last 30 plus years, arbitrarily. I'm starting it at 1995 for a reason I'll say in a moment, and saying that I think we started kind of on this path in the mid-90s, and it's a maybe a 50-year journey. Maybe it's going to be shorter soon. But I kind of take comfort to think we're in the middle of some arc that started in the 90s. And the reason I started in 1995 is because that's the year that Robert Barr and John Tagg published a very famous article that many of you probably read, called From Teaching to Learning, A New Paradigm for Undergraduate Education. For those of us, and I was still pretty young in my career, but for those of us who were working in higher ed reform and teaching and learning in the 90s, when this paper came out, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it was the most important paper to the higher ed talking heads in the 90s, because it galvanized in this way that all the things that people were nibbling at and called it a paradigm shift. So they said, a paradigm shift is taking hold in American higher education. In its briefest form, the paradigm that has governed our colleges is this: a college is an institution that exists to provide instruction. Subtly but profoundly, we are shifting to a new paradigm. A college is an institution that exists to produce learning. This shift changes everything. It is both needed and wanted. So this is 1995. This was like a lightning bolt for a lot of us. So in the article, at the end, they have 3 pages of double columns of things in the instructional paradigm and things as they change in the learning paradigm. It's like 32 or 36 items. I'm going to show you 5. So just to give you an idea, under the instructional paradigm, it's to provide or deliver instruction. Learning paradigm, it's to produce learning. Instructional paradigm, it's about transferring knowledge from faculty to students. Learning paradigm, it's eliciting student discovery. Instructional paradigm, offer courses. Learning paradigm, create powerful learning experience or learning environments. Faculty are primarily lecturers. Faculty are primarily designers. Instructional paradigm, atomistic. People do their own courses and you just hope it adds up to a curriculum. Learning paradigm, you start with the curriculum. What are the learning goals? How do all the pieces fit together? Some of these very familiar, some of these feel like second nature. If you looked at the list, you'd see that we are a long ways from a bunch of things on their list that they thought was going to shift. They say the change is a small change. I don't think so. The change is a small change that changes everything, meaning to make this change. Simply ask, how would we do things differently if we put learning first? Then do it. Just 2 steps. That's all you need to change the university. It will take decades to work out many of the learning paradigm's implications. That was the smartest sentence in there. It's also just a great thing to put in any year's scholarship. It's like, I may be wrong, but you'll be dead. So that is why I say we're in the middle of a 50-year arc. When they say it'll take decades to work out the learning paradigm's implications, I think we're in the middle of those decades. So instead of lamenting that, oh my God, we've been battering away at evidence-based pedagogies for decades, why hasn't everything changed? To instead say, oh, we're in the middle of this journey. And I think it's easy to see that we are in the middle of some journey around this. So one thing that's interesting to me in thinking about the learning paradigm is that it's had a kind of mixed career, this learning part of the learning paradigm. So on the one hand, it gave birth to a really rich vein of scholarship that, those of you who are in Center for Teaching and Learning and Innovation and Learning, this will be familiar. It gave a real rich vein around learning as understanding, deep understanding, learning in the whole student, a number of really important things that came out that got us thinking about what does it mean to really think of the student as a unit of analysis, not just the topic or the subject. So this is kind of that really rich, integrative side of learning. On the other hand, the learning paradigm also gave rise to a lot of very narrow outcomes. It gave rise to developing a lot of programs, a lot of things that actually authorized a lot of those disruptors in 2010, 11, 12, 13, that just focused on very targeted learning skills and whether they were being met. That's also a legacy of the learning paradigm. There's a Dutch writer on philosophy of education that I absolutely love named Geert Biesta. One of his many books called Beyond Learning. He says something has been lost in the shift from the language of education to the language of learning. To him, learning has been too co-opted by narrow uses. He talks about the learnification of education. I'm somewhat sad about this because I've always identified with learning as the thing that we want to promote, but I understand his point, and it serves here. So to me, what's been interesting studying this and thinking about this is that the learning paradigm has had this kind of paradoxical course of progress. It has had this one genealogy to a kind of disintegrative and transactional effect, still learning paradigm, not instructional paradigm. And it also has this rich, integrative, transformative course. So I've been kind of fascinated by that, and I think one of the things that really characterizes this moment is that we have a choice now, and in some ways AI is forcing this opportunity to bring together the disintegrative and the integrative in new ways, to bring together what we learned from this split in a kind of new both and. So there are things like measurable outcomes or granular learning designs for instrumental ends, right? I heard about tons of very innovative things going on here. Micro-credentials, certificates, badges. These are all really good things, right? But absent of a larger vision, they could be very particularized, very granular, very disintegrative, a term that I'm deliberately using just to be annoying. Or pragmatic focus on employability of careers. I don't think we think that's a bad thing. I had my humanities colleagues practically spitting in my face at the beginning of the Red House if I even used the word skills, right? Now that has changed. But the notion of focusing on pragmatic employability seemed at odds with the belief in the higher aims of education. So I think what's interesting is that there have been these tensions in the course of this 50-year arc of the learning paradigm. So I like to think of this, I'm going to throw several frameworks at you today. This is just the first one. That then, if we think of that as a course of progress, we can think of that as one axis. That on the one hand, there's the disintegrative and the transactional. And on the other hand, there's the integrative and the transformational. And by integrative, I mean that, integrating the whole being, integrating your academic learning with experience, integrating, the self and the body and knowledge, interdisciplinarity, lots of ways to think of integrative. And that education is more than the aggregation of the sum of its parts. So that's one axis. That's the kind of education we want someone to get. Is it integrative or something else? The other axis is who do we think deserves that kind of education? So at the top, I put inclusive excellence. I've been assured earlier today that Colorado is still a state in which I can talk about inclusion. So I did not change my slide. I'll do it differently in Texas. But, inclusive excellence, term we all know, versus exclusive excellence, not a term in education. If you Google inclusive excellence, you get 1,000 citations to higher ed. Google exclusive excellence, and you will get luxury resorts in Mexico. But historically, higher education has either been for a small number of qualified and well-prepared students being brought into rich, holistic environments, or equity and access experience, right? And the top is newer. Because inclusion is not easy to talk about everywhere, I decided that an alternative might be whether you're thinking of education as being really just about individual potential, or whether you're thinking about education as also being focused on societal potential. So, I've given away the answer. Like many 2x2s, the upper right is where you want to be. So to me, this is the space we're designing for now, is at this intersection of integrative and transformational and inclusive, right? What does it mean to be integrative and inclusive? What are all the things that we know about designing there? I think you can also sort of map different kinds of institutions in different places. I think liberal arts colleges and universities are on the integrative side, but tend to be much more focused on exclusion, especially through the DEI era. They were being pulled more and more up to the inclusive axis. Broad access, public institutions, community colleges, inclusive, maybe a little bit more toward the disintegrative, but a lot of the work, AAC&U, high impact practices, evidence-based pedagogies, pulling all institutions toward the integrative and valuing integration. So I think that there's a general movement across higher ed, whatever institution, pulling into that quadrant. And I think the question is, what does it mean to design for that quadrant? What does it mean to think going forward? This is all I've heard all day from your wonderful combination of CTL and ALI. What does it mean to design the most integrative transformational education for the broadest number of people? That's the project. And I think the question is, can we get there incrementally, or will that require a paradigm shift or a mind shift? So that's where I want to shift now to a different framework. This is one that I've been using for several years now that's really helped me think about my own work in the Red House. And this is a framework known as the Three Horizons framework. Just out of curiosity, has anybody here heard of or worked with the Three Horizons framework? Okay. McKinsey also has a Three Horizons framework, but it is way less cool. Don't let McKinsey sell you their Three Horizons framework. This was created by a guy named Bill Sharp and a group that he runs called International Futures, but it's been taken up by many people across the globe. So it's called Three Horizons because it has these, what they call three horizons identified by H's. This is the first horizon. It's called H1. That's the dominant paradigm. That's the paradigm that currently exists. It's business as usual. It's often associated with a managerial perspective, which is also not a bad thing. Somebody needs to manage things. And the dominant paradigm does its thing and survives very well until conditions start to shift. And as conditions shift, that paradigm gives you diminishing returns. Okay, so, pedagogies that were built for well-prepared, homogeneous students coming to university, that worked until it didn't. Until then, conditions shifted and we tended to have less well-prepared, diverse people coming in, and suddenly parts of that dominant paradigm started to seem inadequate. And so you get diminishing returns. And it's, in their language, the dominant paradigm becomes increasingly unfit for purpose or less fit for purpose. But it's really hard to change the dominant paradigm. Right? Things get locked in. It's very hard to change one piece of it because things get all interrelated. So that's H1. I'm going to skip to H3. I'll come back to H2. So what they call H3 is the emerging paradigm. That's the thing that you think is coming into existence. It always has seeds in the present, but it's arcing up, and eventually it will be the paradigm that is better fit for the conditions of the moment. It's a system that's in tune with deeper trends that eventually emerge as the new dominant system, perhaps a generation from now. So you could also argue that the learning paradigm would only fully come into being when the conditions around it made it the most fit for purpose, which I think we've all been witnessing for the last decade for sure. H2, the second horizon, is what they call the horizon of disruptive innovation. So it's the horizon that is, it can either be disruptions that are internal or external, and they create opportunities to move from one paradigm to the next. And this is the last technical thing I'll tell you about this, just in case you're worried I'm heading down a rabbit hole. But they talk about that a disruption can either be, or an innovation can either be H2 negative or H2 positive. And H2 negative means that it's an innovation, an incremental innovation, but what it really ultimately does, it feels new, but it ultimately just tends to reinforce the dominant paradigm. An H2 plus innovation is one that helps to advance the emerging paradigm. So first, let me just put it all together here. Right, so this is what it looks like when you put them together. This is what, and you can change the shape of the lines, but it's H1, managerial perspective. H2 is a disruption that's often associated with the entrepreneurial, and H3 is visionary. And the three questions that some people ask is, start at the bottom. What is fading and how can we help it go and leave well? How do we help the dominant paradigm to go out well? What is being born and how do we help it arrive well? And then in H2, what is being disruptive and how can it be harnessed and not captured? So, for example, if I populate the slide with bar and tags language, so those two circles at the top is just taken straight from the bar and tag categories that I showed you when I talked about the learning paradigm. The instructional paradigm was transfer knowledge, faculty primarily lecturers, atomistic curriculum. The other things on the other side are on the learning paradigm. That's their paradigm shift, that we were moving from an H1 of instruction to an H3 of learning. What's interesting about this then, this is not about predicting the future. This is about having conversations about the future. It's meant to be a tool by which communities can have a conversation about multiple competing visions of the present and the future. But when you then have an H2 disruption, whether it's external or internal, you can then ask, is this reinforcing the dominant paradigm or is it bringing us to the new one? So, for example, the COVID pivot to remote instruction, right? Did that help usher in a new paradigm of learning? Or did it just ultimately, once it was all over, strengthen the dominant paradigm? A couple of years ago, that was a really interesting question to ask people. Now we've all forgotten about that. So who cares? we have bigger calamities to worry about. But at the time, I think a lot of us in the teaching and learning industry were thinking, oh my God, we just got everybody to start thinking purposefully about their pedagogy. Things will never be the same. So, interesting to ask that question. Same with generative AI as a disruptive innovation. Is generative AI and all that it entails going to reinforce the dominant paradigm or help usher in a different paradigm? It's interesting, in the conversation I was having, I was privileged enough to be in with all the wonderful people from the CTL and the ALI. We were talking about what would shift a paradigm. One person said, for example, in AI, there are these equity-centered new assessment approaches that now more people are interested in because they realize that AI has deconstructed the assessments that they're giving. They're not there to learn about equity-centered assessments. They're there to figure out how to get past what the AI is deconstructing. But the effect is the same, that now people are open to hearing about paradigm-shifting assessment practices that they may not have been before AI. That's a great example of where, under certain circumstances, a disruption can be H2 positive. It can potentially move us towards something emergent. And I think part of what it means to try to do change inside a university is figuring out how do you create the right supports, momentum, and incentives to take the disruptions that are happening and move people toward a new paradigm. And just to be perfectly clear about it, so that's what I thought the Red House's job was, that the Red House's job was to be H2 positive. The Red House's job was to do rule-breaking innovation that ultimately was H2 plus, that was ultimately innovations that would move us toward an emerging paradigm, and to constantly be asking, does it feel like it's getting us towards something new? I also think it's worth asking, is the learning paradigm still the thing we're aiming at, or has it broadened? And I think we probably now know enough, and especially with AI, that there's probably something on the other side of the learning paradigm. So here's my periodization. Kirk, you can call me on this periodization. 250 BCE to the 1990s, that's the instructional paradigm. 1990s to the 2020s, that's the learning paradigm, and within a decade we'll be in a new paradigm, which I'm calling the Human Flourishing Paradigm, right? So it's the learning paradigm, but in a way, it's a way of avoiding the disintegration of the learning paradigm by saying, let's not call it a learning paradigm, let's call it a human flourishing paradigm. That by its very nature, it's holistic. It's about human potential, not about learning outcomes. It'll be inclusive of that, but it will not stop there. So, you can put any paradigm up there and say, are we moving toward it? Plus, it's also worth saying, every era's H1 was some prior era's H3, right? In the mid-19th century, when Charles Eliot invented all those things that we're now decrying. The credit hour, the elective system, majors, disciplinary divisions, deep professional specializations. When all that happened in the late 19th century, that seemed like a huge improvement over what had been there. That was the late 19th century's H3. Now it's RH1. Right? So whatever you want to put there, you can. But the most important thing to me that I deeply believe is that if you don't have a strong H3, and if you don't have a community conversation about a strong H3, then you cannot innovate toward it. If you're not talking about what it is you think you're going, then you can't innovate toward it. It's like that quote, that quotation that is attributed to the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu. If you do not change direction, you're likely to end up where you're going, right? So this, we need a different direction if we're going to end up somewhere else. And to me, that is especially important in the era of AI disruption, right? There's a woman that I love reading her stuff. This woman, she actually holds a chair in integral ecology in the Netherlands, but she wrote this wonderful piece on AI. And one of the things she said, the thing that worries me most about AI is our weakness as users. That we're weak, humans are weak, right? If we can do something without exerting effort, we will. If we can have a relationship without putting a lot of effort into it, we'll do that, right? She's concerned about that as humans, and I'm concerned about that as higher education. That higher education has many weaknesses as a user of new things. And that as we absorb to this seismic shift with AI, I'm worried we'll end up just incrementing on the dominant paradigm. So I wanted to share with you, see if I can do this pretty quickly. I want to share with you sort of just 3 innovations that we're working on now out of the Red House that both kind of illustrate to me where we've been and how the scale at which we've been working has been growing, doing this small rule-changing thing, but also what I think of as this crossing of reinvention and rehumanization. So I'll just go through all 3 pretty quickly so we have some time for Q&A. So the first thing is, at the beginning of the fall, we launched something called the Future of Experiential Learning series. As I saw everybody scrambling to do everything with AI, which we're very involved in that too, I thought we need to step back and have a different kind of conversation and engage the campus in the conversation about what would it look like to put human experience at the center of the curriculum. So we started a whole series of things, many different workshops and things. I can talk more about it. But the premise was, this is the yin and yang of what it means to have human-centered learning. Clearly, human AI teaming, human AI interaction is going to be a huge part of our future. But the experiential piece, we need to think about and nurture separately. What does it mean to have a human-centered education heading into the rest of this decade? And in particular, the 2 questions that we launched the series with was, what version of education are we bringing to the education AI integration? And what version of human are we bringing to human AI interaction? Let's not talk about the AI side of that. Let's talk about the human side of that. Right? So that's what this series was about. And we launched it in September and ran it all fall, many different workshops. But we did it under the banner of Rehumanizing the university and said, this is what this is really about. It's really about rehumanizing the university, the future, not just of experiential learning, which has the plus of being familiar, but also we all think, oh, that's work experience. But we meant experiential learning, like the very essence of the human experience, down to things like attention and presence and care and curiosity, which actually somebody was sharing with me yesterday, but I guess I already knew that curiosity comes from the same Latin word as care. Right? One of the things we did across the entire fall, group after group after group, is we said, what are the human capacities that we think are going to be essential to the future with AI? And then we asked people to say, we have long lists, which of those capacities do we think we're good at designing for, and which do we think we're not? By wide consensus, those things everyone agreed we're terrible at doing those, that there's nothing intentional about the curriculum that fosters those. And in fact, there's many things about the curriculum and being a high achieving place that actually works against those things. But that list, learning from failure, navigating ambiguity, imagination, creativity, humility, widely agreed. These are some of the most important things for our future, and we never think about what it means to design them into our future. So we started to identify these capacities, but then we also started asking, well, what if we start to center experiential learning? What are our principles about that? And things like student agency, integrating perspectives, fostering community, reflecting critically, designing for relevance. Like we got this very rich set of community principles. This is what I think it means to have an H3 conversation, to start talking about what is it that we are moving toward, right? And that's how I see this work. And then in the next slide, which I know you can't really read that well, but we started asking, well, what if we thought of the curriculum as much as a trajectory of his experiences as a collection of courses? What would that look like? What does foundational experiential learning look like versus intermediate or versus, advanced or transitioning out? And then we started identifying the areas of work that we now have faculty design groups working on this spring. And I want to just focus on one, this mentored challenge-based learning. I have been teaching a course since 2013 called The University as a Design Problem. Teacher at the undergraduate level and the graduate level. In fact, I just taught my graduate level course half hour before this talk. This was from the second year of this course, 2014, group of 3 undergraduates named Naman, Delbert, and Essie. Their project was called Yugi, which Essie was a classics major and felt that this was supposed to be Yugi, meaning the plural of team. I know she didn't quite get that right. I've had plenty of classicists in the audience tell me that over the years. But it's a delightful term, Yugi, and it's stuck. It's 2014. Just real quickly, I want to share this with you. So they had a vision of to them, a Yugi was like a problem-based community of practice. And they said, what if the whole purpose of this course back then was to design the Georgetown 20 years later. So this was like designing the Georgetown of 2034. What if Georgetown could promote knowledge synthesis through collaborative projects from day one to graduation involving students, professors, staff, and practitioners? They had a whole set of features they described. I'm just going to show you 2 slides. It says, Yugis are project families that reverse the course-centric learning model, right? These are like problem-based communities of practice. Could be water quality in the district, could be racism, whatever. This is their beautiful diagrams. Today, you have a class, maybe you have a lab, right? In the future, the most important thing you do when you come to college is you choose a Yugi. You figure out, what Yugi do I want to join? Not pick a major, not pick your classes. What's the Yugi I want to join? Surrounding the Yugi was what they charmingly called knowledge packets, what you and I would call knowledge. So then they had this whole elaborate theory that in a Yugi, it would all be coded for the kinds of competencies you could get there, what you were good at, what did you want to get good at, that's what those things meant. And then surrounding the Yugi were things you could also do. You could take a lecture series. You could take an online course. You could join a reading group. They acknowledged these were all really good things to learn, ways to learn. But the essence was your work in this Yugi. And this was their curriculum. This was their entire curriculum. And you went through a series of Yugis that moved you from guidance to independence and from simplicity to complexity. And they had their graduation requirement was 1 sentence. And they said, you can graduate when you can play a non-peripheral role in a level 4 Yugi. That's when you knew you could leave the university. I have been obsessing about this since 2014. And now one of my major projects is to create what we're now calling challenge labs, not Yugis, challenge labs, and create a whole architecture of challenge labs for Georgetown, and to think of them as one of Georgetown's signature pedagogies. And I think that this aligns with where we're going with AI, with human capacity, and with a world that is badly in need of repairing its wicked problems. The goal is that within 5 years, every single student will graduate Georgetown with at least one significant UGI experience. And what I'm trying to do is to create an architecture that brings all these challenge labs into some kind of ecosystem. We already have a bunch of different ones. I'm sure you have many courses here that are like this too. Technology impact, environmental. We have one just emerging this fall on democracy and society and AI, and one that's in my shop that we're doing on AI and wicked problems. That one is going to be using AI and AI agents to teach students how to really do deep work on wicked problems. But we're doing it both as an undergraduate course and as slices of executive education with corporate, mid-career corporate partners who want to learn how to use AI. And then there will be 4 engagements across the semester where the undergraduates and these executives come together to work in intergenerational teams on AI and wicked problems. I believe that the future, not only is challenge labs our future, but intergenerational challenge labs is our future. And we see them as you can have a course with a couple of engagements, you can create a semester-long version, or you can have a UGI that lasts many years and you create different things with inside of it. So that to me is, and these are examples of what it means to think about moving toward a new paradigm. What does it mean to create real pilots or prototypes that feel legible and even exciting to people here and now for the job they do, but we're creating them because we think this is where education's going and that we need to get good at these. So if in 5-10 years, that's the center of education, we've socialized ourselves to these ideas, right? Without a strong H3, you don't know where you're going. So last thing, that then brings us to the question of how does this all add up to the degree? So the other major thing that I've been working on now with the blessing of the board and the president is how do we address rising costs? How do we increase the value and relevance of the Georgetown degree? And how do we do it in a way that's financially sustainable for the university? So that's my triple bottom line. And as we've been thinking about this problem, we've started to ask, what does it mean to think differently about the journey across the 4 years? There's a lot of movement in the United States right now toward 3-year bachelors. I've been involved in that movement. I don't think any of us think that for traditional age students, a 3-year bachelor's is probably the best thing. But how do we keep that 4-year arc and reimagine what it is? And the major mindset shift here is to stop thinking of the 4th year as the final year and to think of it as a high-impact transition year, so that most of the coursework might unfold in the first 3 years and summers, and then we think of the 4th year as a more deeply immersion year. So we're trying to think about not 4-year degrees, but different combinations of 3+1s or 3+1s+1s. And just quickly, some of this involves integrating bachelor's and master's. It happens here, I'm sure. We have just passed a rule to make it an even deeper integration. But it also means rethinking the 4th year to be more about research immersions or more about work-learn co-ops. Obviously very common in engineering, not common in other fields. But research immersion might be maybe you join a level 4 UGI for like 9 credits in one of your semesters in the senior year. But we think of that not just as deepening your academic learning, but actually as professional development for a job market in which first-year positions are disappearing. So I'm moving really fast here. There's a million things to say, but to me, this is now the ultimate trying to think about what reinvention and rehumanization is how do you reinvent for value, reinvent for relevance, for costs, but to say, what does it mean to deepen human potential as part of that degree path? How do you keep it integrative and transformative, but also make it cheaper and highly pragmatic and highly relevant? So to me, all 3 of these things I've shared with you, experiential learning series, challenge labs, rethinking degrees, are all part of what I think of as now the kind of cresting of my work of thinking of the Red House's work as H2 positive, things that we're actually trying to change now, but mindful of what we believe is an emerging human flourishing paradigm that we actually have no idea how much the world is going to change beyond recognition in the next 5, 10, 15 years. Let me just finish. Last quotation, this is my final slide, going back to my theory crush. He says, to engage in learning always entails the risk that learning might have an impact on you, that learning might change you. This means that education only begins when the learner is willing to take a risk. I love this for probably obvious reasons. To me, this also speaks so much to the future. Those human capacities that we know will be essential to an AI integrated future. What does it take to educate someone to be able to take a risk for the sake of learning, for the sake of education? Not just knowing how to live with ambiguity, experimentation, failure. What do you have to feel to take a risk? You have to feel a sense of belonging. You have to feel a sense of trust. You have to feel a sense of community. So that's why I love this quotation. But I also think I love, and I didn't do it overtly on this slide, but sometimes I do, education only begins now when the university is willing to take a risk, when the faculty member is willing to take a risk. What does it mean to support an institution or a faculty in learning to take a risk so that education at this moment in history can begin? That's all of our challenge. Thank you.